Hello and welcome to Mindful Mondays. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Michelle Precourt, and this is episode 17 of Mindful Mondays as we come to a close to 2022. Hard to believe. Before I introduce Mark here, who's with us today, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Mindful Mondays and what it's all about. Really, this is about collective wisdom, sharing of knowledge, information about HR, hot topics, pain points for employers, pain points for employees. We've had some really great discussions here on Mindful Mondays. We've talked about corporate culture, career-related stress, mental health at work. This for me, it's a bit of a passion project. It's really about creating healthier humans and more sustainable workplace cultures. So this feeds in really nicely to our conversation today with our guest, Mark. Hello, Mark. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks, Michelle. Lovely to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. So Mark, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Mark. So he's calling in from the UK today, but originally he comes from South Africa.
Yep.
He runs an organization called Connectivity Consulting. And what he does is really, it's about enabling already high-performing teams to do even more. And part of that is through the transformation of behaviors. Mm-hmm. And, I love this, Mark, because the work that I do in mindfulness is also about transforming behaviors. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Thanks so much for joining us.
More than welcome. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so let me just check in here on the chat and see what is happening more. Here we are. So I'd love to hear from our viewers. I always love to hear from our viewers. Where are you calling in from? Would love to hear. I was a bit remiss in that. I would like to note that I'm calling in from the territories of the Squamish people. And I really do appreciate their stewardship of this land, this beautiful country that we live in. And it's otherwise known as Squamish, British Columbia, here on the west coast of Canada. If you're, please, I'd love to hear from where you're calling in from, whether that's the Indigenous community or the city and province, or maybe the state, the country. We've crossed borders here on Mindful Mondays, and I'm really, really pleased about that. So let me just check here. Okay, no comments yet, but we love to hear from our viewers. So please chime in, and any questions for myself, any questions for Mark, would love to hear those so that we can, be of service in the most meaningful way. So we're here to talk about vulnerability, but Mark, I'd like to take a step back. What does vulnerability, and I'll even maybe narrow this down a little bit, vulnerability in the workplace, what does this really mean? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
So you're making me think, and I was just looking up at my screen because I got a couple of quotes or some academic references that have helped me in the past. And so if we start there and just give it some reference, that might be useful. So the one that your viewers may know is Brené Brown, and she sort of defines vulnerability as the emotion that we experience during the times of risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure, and that's from one of her books in 2016. There's a more academic one from Mayer, Lefavre, and Robinson from 2017, which is not too dissimilar, but it's manifest in the willingness to be honest and open to learning, some of the points that you've raised already, by accepting our own fallibility and thus taking responsibility for one's own actions, being more responsive to others and sharing responsibility. So those sort of guide me. I haven't been able to find many other sort of definitions. So what does it mean to me? I use that as a bit of a guide point and a reference. But it's more of a process. So what it means to me, it's a bit of a process in terms of awareness, understanding how I'm showing up, how I'm choosing to be in the moment, how I'm choosing to connect with people. What is the space I'm looking to create between, say, for example, you and me? I may have a view on something, you may have a view on something, and as we come into that, we may enter into a little bit of disagreement. And so, do I hold that space with you and seek and feel a little uncomfortable with the conflict, and try to seek clarity and maintain the connection? or do I feel uncomfortable with that and maybe pull back a little bit? So thinking of those references that we just heard, and some of the points that I've raised, it sort of starts falling into that space for me. Definitely got an emotional component to it for me, and I tend to feel it most when I'm with a client and I've got to be brave. And there's a lovely English expression where they say you've got to put your big girl pants on. Okay. And so that happens when I start having to flag something like something where I've got to introduce what are you guys not talking about? And that can be quite powerful sometimes. And I have to hold that for myself. So I notice my process, hold myself in that space, push myself a little bit and step into that discomfort and make myself a little bit vulnerable. So I take a risk. It gets uncertain. There is a little bit of emotional exposure because I don't know how people are going to react to me. So it's sort of all of those in a way, sort of playing together. And so it's a process and just trying to become aware and acknowledge what's going on sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the point that you made about that checking in, right? So that am I holding back for the purposes of, maybe not wanting to react in a certain way, or am I holding back because I'm concerned with being vulnerable, with maybe countering that opinion. And so I think that's something for us as leaders to really consider, that, when we're talking about vulnerability, it can look many different ways. Some folks may think it's, the person on the team who is highly expressive all of the time and going, oh, here we go again. This is Mark, on his soapbox, and he's, an oversharer. And there are folks like that for sure. And I'm not saying that that's good or bad. It's just the way it is. But I think it's more than that. This idea of being able to really use your voice in a meaningful way so that people can react and respond, right? If you're not vulnerable, it's a little bit like the iceberg analogy, right? There's only this up top and everything else that's underneath. We don't know what's going on if you don't say anything. So I think there's some of that going on. I'm not sure if that resonates with you, Mark.
Absolutely. If I bring back into the picture and into our discussion the idea that vulnerability is part of a process, then it starts to become a little less packaged, or a little bit like a box with a bow on it. It tends to become a little bit more fluid, and then we can bend and we can shift with it. What you were describing in the way is also, in one way, not the only way, in one way, it talks to invulnerability. Because sometimes people who show up and talk a lot, they may be feeling vulnerable. So the way they look after themselves is they become invulnerable, and there's just a lot of noise and opinion. I mean, with respect, maybe not noise, but a lot of opinion and thoughts and perspectives, versus maybe slowing down, recognizing that there's a really important question to answer, or a more difficult, challenging question to answer, and coming into that. So what I look for as a team coach when I'm working with teams is I'm looking for the balance. And so I'm looking for what I call the shadow. I'm looking for what's working and also what's not working. So if I see too many opinions, too many perspectives, too many position taking, that's an indication in itself of invulnerability, which to me is equally important to look at, to see the vulnerability. So when that shows up, so I use that as a reference point. So there's this balance that plays out, and this flow that happens with a team. And sometimes teams will look after, and individuals will look after themselves in a certain way and overshare or talk too much. And that can show up in many different ways. People who go very quiet and withdraw and will only come in at certain times. Again, it's not necessarily one thing. So I'm very, very conscious of not judging it or making an assumption. It's watching carefully and just noticing where it's ebbing and flowing, where it's pulling back, where it's coming in, and trying to get a sense of what that might be about. So yeah, there's this lovely balance that plays out, and it happens for the individual. It happens for the individual as they bring themselves into the team, and then that happens for the team as well. So those three sort of pieces, but it's this constantly moving sort of feast of of interaction with the individual with themselves, feeling vulnerable, invulnerable, coming in, teams being vulnerable, invulnerable, and that sort of plays out and impacts the team's performance. So your point earlier about how does this help HR, how does this help leaders is the time saving for one, addressing the issue for another, getting the difficult issues on the table isn't always the leader's responsibility. The leader is certainly an enabler, absolutely, but it's also for the individual not to be over dependent, but to come in. And so when HR leaders watch this for their teams, they're certainly activators, but sometimes just pulling back might be enough vulnerability for them to not take control.
Yeah.
To not fill the space, and just to pull back gently, let go of some of that control in space, and to see what emerges can be hugely powerful for them.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
both vulnerability and invulnerability playing out there. So.
Yeah. I really like what you said, Mark, there about this isn't just the leader's responsibility. And there's a few comments in the chat. I want to get to those right away, but I let's just role play this a little bit. I'd like to role play this a little bit, if you don't mind, Mark, because sometimes the words that are coming out of the mouth are an indication of something else going on. So I could say something like, Mark, I can't take anything else on. Like, you've got to be kidding me. This is 4 days before I'm going on vacation. Like, no, I'm not doing it. So, sorry. And I'm not taking anything else on, Mark. But if those types of words come out, and I suspect that that people are really vocal about something that's upsetting them, is that vulnerability or is that something else?
Again, there's probably many ways of looking at this. But if someone's showing up with some energy and is saying, I just can't do anymore, I mean, I start to get a little bit curious, and I would encourage leaders to get a little curious, just to at least explore that, rather than coming in hard to try and match that energy. And to, the old approach might be to shut that down completely. Whereas when somebody's showing up in that space, a little bit of compassion, a little bit of empathy, but at the same time, if you know the person, just knowing where their boundaries are, and so you can then start to explore it, and even in just with a little bit of time, I might come into you and say, I'm hearing you going on holiday, and it sounds like you've got a whole lot on, and you don't have the capacity to take any more on. So let's help me understand what's going on. And so I can enter into a conversation where I offer my help and offer my sort of compassion and empathy for you, not sympathy, and just start to connect and build that connection, because I start to get curious and I want to know what's going on a little bit. That doesn't mean I have to take it all on, but at least just want to unpack a little bit. And so I might say, with a little introduction to some vulnerability, yeah, Michelle, I can relate to how you might be feeling. I don't, I'm not in your shoes, but I can certainly appreciate what it's like to have an exceptional amount of work, and I'm feeling the same as you, and I'm feeling overloaded as well. So let's figure out how we can work this out together, because I might be able to take some stuff off you before you go and leave, and then when you come back, maybe you can help me out.
Yeah, and
so these little gestures, little steps.
I also appreciate what you said there about not taking it on, right? What you said was, help me understand what's going on, right? Not, okay, you know what? Let's take a look at your project plan. What can I take on, right? It wasn't about that. And maybe it is that, right? Maybe, and every conversation is so different. This is where, as leaders, I think what you're getting at, Mark, is to assess the situation, and then, take some steps from there about how might we be able to help. So you also mentioned this, what I call positive leader role modeling. What you said was, I was up here pretty, fierce, and you didn't come up and meet me here. What you did was, okay, let's take a step back. And if this is a peer-to-peer thing versus some sort of supervisory position, the other thing that comes to mind is something like, take a breath and do you want to go grab a coffee, right? Or let's just not talk about work for a minute. Maybe it's in a virtual environment, and just go like, you're going on holidays. I didn't know that. Tell me
Yeah,
more about it.
exactly.
It could be something like that. So thanks for playing along with that.
Hollywood beckons.
Yeah. I want to say hi to some of the folks here. So we've got a couple of people calling in from Ottawa. So hello, Greg Logren. He's with the Logren Group. If you haven't met Greg yet, be sure to connect with him on LinkedIn here. Also, Diane. Hi, Diane. It's been a while. She's also calling in from Ottawa. David, it's been a long time. David Dottie's here joining us from Salt Lake City. Utah is such a beautiful state. Elizabeth, our regular, always so happy to see you here. And finally, Deepika, thanks for sharing some information about Mark here. I just want to put this up on screen. So you can find him through connectivity.co.uk. You can also find him here on LinkedIn. I'm going to hide this one here, and I'm just going to see what David is sharing here. So David, I like what Mark just said about little steps towards connection. And that is one of the best things to do, is to be curious. As Ted Lasso says, be curious, not judgmental. Oh, that's so amazing. Thanks so much, David, for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Okay. So let's take a look at, we kind of dove right in here. So I want to take a look at our questions that we had discussed previously. So
Sure.
What about this idea of invulnerability, or this, when people are holding back? In your opinion, what's the impact of that?
So let's look at it in a couple of areas as that plays out. So invulnerability. You think I'd get that right, knowing what? I think from an individual perspective, my personal journey with invulnerability has been I've learned to protect myself, or I learned to protect myself in a certain way. I learned to look after myself in a certain way. And so I kept a distance. So learned over many years, and then in organization and organizational life that would play out. So whereas I thought I was connecting with people, I probably wasn't connecting as deeply or as openly or in the way that I thought I was. So if I then play that out into a team, people maybe didn't feel that they knew me as well. And so that can, I'm not saying it always does, but it can lead to some assumptions sometimes. And if I was feeling invulnerable, maybe my language was a little clipped and a little short. My own personal approach is I tend to focus on the tip of the iceberg rather than the whole iceberg. So I talk to it really quickly. And that can get misinterpreted sometimes as being missing the point, or it's black and white, when actually there's a whole lot of stuff underneath, but I'm not necessarily talking to that. And because I'm trying to read the room, etc. But the whole time I'm holding myself back. So it can play out. Where leaders will find this playing out is they may find themselves carrying, so if that plays out to me in a team with a leader, it might be that they start to carry the load because I'll take responsibility for some stuff, but I may not necessarily go the extra mile because I'm concerned that if I do, people may view me in a certain way or judge me. And so I'll just play it safe. Now, there's a lot more grey to this than it may come across a bit black and white, but there's certainly a bit of grey in this. So for a leader, they may end up having to motivate the meeting and energize it and keep it going and right, who's next, and pull the agenda together. So the accountability starts to shift onto the leader. And so what can happen is people sit quietly, give the bare minimum, and the meeting just ticks over with the leader driving it. And now that's... I've exaggerated that a little bit, but I have seen that play out with teams on quite a frequent basis, where the leader's driving everything, trying to keep it motivated and focused, getting it going, get people through, and people are just disengaged, cameras off, not participating, etc. Yeah. And that can at times, not always, but can come from a variety of feelings related to vulnerability. There may be stuff personally going on at home that's impacting. There may be stuff playing out in their personal lives, and they may be feeling something about work, and so they show up in a certain way. But invulnerability, in a very practical way, I've seen it cost businesses, first of all, time, and time is money. I've seen leaders get burnt out and stressed out because they're carrying too much and individuals, and trying to bring individuals in is possibly a way forward. I'm not sure I'm describing this the best way, but invulnerability can play out in many ways. Corporate speak, wearing a mask, you don't necessarily see the real person show up. And so there's this distance, and there's this, we believe we've got to behave in a certain way, we've got to speak in a certain way. And so I call it head talk versus actually showing up with the balance between head and heart. And that's, again, something I look for. Is it too corporate-y? And at times that's appropriate, but at other times, maybe when there's a bit of conflict, bringing a little bit of heart sometimes can help balance things and just ease things down and just reduce a little bit. So again, it's that flow and that balance and looking for where that is. But there are times when teams will exist just in invulnerability because that's what they've learned and that's what they're comfortable with. So, so the cost is time. It can play out in money. It can play in accountability, ownership. Lencioni's triangle is the 5 dysfunctions of a team is one that comes to mind, which is a great example or a great sort of model to think of where invulnerability may play out. So one of the key things is low trust. And so if you have low trust, then that plays out all the way through because you're not necessarily having the right conversations. So therefore, you're not necessarily buying into them, and so therefore, you're not really got skin in the game. So it's a great model for both having a look at where invulnerability can really play out in the team, and it's also quite personal at times as well. I don't know if that answers the question, Michelle, but there's quite a bit in that.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit a few key points for me. I love The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. That's the book that you referenced by Patrick Lencioni. And 100%, if there's a lack of trust there, that whether I'm vulnerable or I'm not vulnerable, it's not going to bode well, then I'm simply, there's no trust, right? So that is, that's a great model to consider. And for anyone that's listening today, I highly recommend this book. I've had it on my bookshelf for a really long time, and I just read it this year, actually, a couple of months ago, and it's really great. You talked about burnout, and I also think that if you're holding things in and not expressing, I'm not suggesting that the way we just role played a few minutes ago and me being is necessarily appropriate from a business code of conduct perspective, but the absence of that and expressing where you're feeling overwhelmed or not trusting is, I think, a good example of invulnerability.
Yeah. There's a couple of other points. I mean, I have a list in my mind sometimes, not a list, but some of the behaviors that I'm looking for when it comes to invulnerability is some of the things that show up for me that I'm keeping an eye up on, and I'm just looking over here because I've got them on a slide that I shared with a client recently. Very little actual listening sometimes. We mentioned curiosity that David brought in, that Ted Lesser said, be curious, not judgmental. Invulnerability possibly in there. Very little interpersonal sharing, speaking in the third person, we versus I. So the ownership and the assumption sits out in the team rather than I think that this is important versus we might think, or we don't think this is important. It's the I that sort of starts to shift things. Tumbleweed moments. This amazing thing, not amazing, but somebody will say something and then you might introduce something completely different. And so I'm left with very little acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And so the silence thing we do to each other. So it talks to possibly invulnerability, lots of corporate speak, leader dependent, quite solution focused. Now, what I mean by that is when you see vulnerability really starting to play, people become willing to put ideas in a broad sense, or really willing to take a risk with ideas, good or bad, just to put them out there. But what I see instead of ideas is I see rapid fire solutions. So here's the problem, here's what we're going to do. And sometimes that is appropriate, let's be clear. But when you are throwing a whole range of things at an issue without diagnosing it and really listening to each other and exploring and getting really curious about what that actually is and just doing the tip of the iceberg, there's time, there's cost, there's tons of resource that gets put into place and impacts motivation, engagement, all sorts of stuff as that starts to play out down the line, so to speak. So The other thing that you mentioned and we were talking about is that takes a huge amount of effort. And we don't necessarily always realize it. So invulnerability can lead to exhaustion. And I've seen it with certain clients where they're doing so many things rather than 3 or 4 because they haven't really listened. They haven't really got curious, haven't really checked in and played back what they've heard, asked more questions. But as they start to do that, they start to realize they may have missed the real issue. And so they get more curious and they dive in and they start to unpack that a little bit. But yeah, there's a whole range of things that can cause this high level of personal exhaustion, time poor, and work-life balance starting to play out. Now, again, it's one aspect. It's not the only. There's many others. But I think invulnerability, this learned invulnerability, can certainly play out in many ways and impact our personal health and well-being.
Yeah. I really appreciate what you're saying. And to our viewers out here, you can see that Mark has some really good experience in this, sharing some client information, some client, I guess this is part of your materials that you share with your clients. So I appreciate that.
Sure.
What also comes to mind for me is something that you said about the tumbleweed example, where I actually had this example come up with me, this tumbleweed, where I was in a meeting like this. It was a Zoom call. And the organizer of this meeting was looking for some ideas. We were doing a bit of a SWOT analysis. And I had shared some opportunities. And while some of the other comments that were shared were recognized right away, mine wasn't. And so from a vulnerability perspective, I was thinking, well, am I just being ignored here? Or, I don't know. I was just like, no, I'm going to bring this up. So I took an additional step of vulnerability there because they shared what I thought was a really good opportunity for moving forward, but I was hearing nothing back. Yep. So then I came, and this was all through chat. So then I came on mic and I said, by the way, I shared something in the chat. It hasn't been addressed. Maybe you're suggesting it's a terrible idea, or maybe you just haven't come to it yet. And they said, no, Michelle, we're just getting caught up here. So, but that could have gone a few different ways, right? I was making a bit of an assumption, which is where vulnerability it doesn't feel good if you're being vulnerable and it's not being addressed, right? So I was getting silence on the other end about this idea. And then I thought, you know what? I trust these people enough that I can be quite forward and say, maybe this is a terrible idea, but this is what I'm bringing to the table. Yep. And so then we were able to talk about it.
Absolutely. And you introduce a lovely concept there, which is giving people the benefit of the doubt. So whilst there was silence, our invulnerability or our vulnerability might lead us to do certain things, withdraw and not ask, and then carry something away from that, particularly if it's repeated a few times of that happens, and then we might attach some judgment to it, versus what you spoke to there was possibly giving benefit of the doubt and going, I know these guys, let me lean in and just ask this question. When I work with clients, and for any team coach, not just me, trusting yourself to lean in and check in on the processes, what is the silence about, is hugely powerful. And so for HR leaders and leaders out there, when you notice that, lean in a little bit. Those first little steps I mentioned before, those first little steps of connection, check in, because what might be happening is a little bit what Brené talks about is shaming a little bit, not necessarily intentionally, a lack of acknowledgement. And so people don't get heard. And so the quickest way to start helping a team move into vulnerability is to start acknowledging what people said. And you'll know you've hit it on the head because people start to smile. And they might give you a little bit of information if you've missed 1 or 2 points. But if you've nailed it, when you've heard them say something and you play it back, they will go, yep, no, that's it, that's spot on. And now you've got a connection, now you've got understanding, now trust is being established. But the point that you raised there was lovely because you came back in. And if there's one thing I would encourage when people are feeling invulnerability, a great technique is, no matter how difficult it may feel, is just try come back in and reconnect and seek clarity about what it is, because there may well be something going on. And so it reduces assumption, it reduces judgment, and it brings in clarity, which is so essential for teams to avoid wasting time and effort and resource on something that may have been misunderstood, and then put in as a solution or an idea to go, or a solution to go run with, versus an idea. So it can play out. But it's a beautiful story you just told there in terms of coming back in. Not hard to do, but it can feel difficult to do. But maybe that is the lesson of vulnerability. It is a vital teacher. The process is an incredible teacher, because as you step into it, it brings you so much more insight and awareness of, I feel this way when I do that. I did feel that way. Oh, it wasn't so bad. And maybe I misjudged that. Maybe I had an assumption. And that may play over time. So the next time you come in, you'll go, actually, that didn't feel too bad. Let me ask that question again. Guys, did you hear me?
Yeah.
And so it starts to shift and move. And then the next level you become aware of that as your awareness increases. So both are equally powerful teachers once you start to move into vulnerability.
Thanks for sharing that, Mark. Some of the tangible takeaways that I'm hearing from you is to, circle back, come back to it in a way that is meaningful for you, right? So another way that I could have in that example was after emailed or called the organizer and said, I had this idea. I just wanted to circle back to you and get your thoughts, right? So there's different ways. You could certainly do it in a public forum if you feel that you're going to be supported in that.
Yes.
And if not, there's other ways of doing that. So
yeah, many other ways to ask the question, many other ways to bring yourself in that you're comfortable with. My overall point would be find a way to just bring yourself back in gently into the process, because something's moving, something's working. And so the vulnerability is, how do I bring myself into this? If you try and jump on a moving train that's at a platform, you're likely to bounce off. But if you run next to it and find a way to grab hold and then jump onto the foot stand and then go in, it's a little different. It's a strange analogy, I know, but it's more around the energy and how you bring yourself into it and then how you feel. And find something that's right for you, but find a way to gently bring yourself back into it. It's those little steps of connection, those little steps of vulnerability. It doesn't have to be a big bang, ta-da, here I am, in me and everything. Sometimes it's, guys, would you mind if it goes quiet? What you can do is just go, can you repeat the last point, guys? I didn't quite catch that. And so you bring yourself in and reconnect. And that can also be a little bit of vulnerability sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we could talk for hours on this, and I'm noticing the time. I want to be respectful of yours. You're into your evening now. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today here on Mindful Mondays.
Time has flown. I'm happy to go on for a little longer if anyone would like. I don't have to drop off immediately, but I'll take your steer on that, Michelle. But
awesome. I really appreciate that.
No problem. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. If there's any final questions for Mark while you have him here, please throw those into the chat. While we're waiting for those, I would like to thank our viewers here for showing up. Every month, we typically meet the third Monday of the month. However, today, first Monday of the month, and that's purely for me and my self-serving purposes because I'm going on vacation. My husband and I will be heading south to Costa Rica for a few weeks. And in terms of vulnerability, it's been a busy few months. So thankful for the amazing clients that I have an opportunity to work with. But it also means that I've been working really hard and fast these days. So I need a break. And so I'll be offline for a few weeks. However, the next Mindful Monday, our first Mindful Monday of 2023, will be on January 21st. I am so excited to have this gentleman joining us today. You may know him as Gurdeep. Gurdeep Pandya has inspired us, has certainly inspired me with his message of hope, joy, and positivity. Such an amazing gentleman. I see he's performed all across the country. He did a summer tour in 2022. He's performed on Parliament Hill on different TV shows across the country. And I had the pleasure of meeting Gurdeep in Whistler, British Columbia. I absolutely love his message. And so I asked him if he would join us for Mindful Monday to share his traditional Punjabi folk dance. It's called Bhangra, and it brings people together. You just can't not smile when you see Gurdeep perform. We're going to have a conversation about how his work creates happier, healthier communities, and that is on January 21st. I want to just check in with the chat here. So there's someone here who's really excited. Oh, wow, Gurdeep, I've followed him for years and seen him in Whistler. He's so good, so good. So that's going to be the 21st of January. Quick note of thanks, Deepika, for sharing all of the links here today. Diana, David, Greg. I know that there's others here who haven't shared in the chats. Namita, thank you so much for joining us. And Mark, I really wish you a happy Christmas and happy holiday season.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And for everyone who's joined, really appreciate you listening. Hopefully you took something from it. I don't consider myself an expert in any way, shape or form. I've just learned from others and on my own journey. And so hopefully people took something from that. And I'm always happy to connect on LinkedIn. And I just want to thank you as well in front of your guests. I'm really grateful and humbled to have been asked. So thank you. It's very kind of you. And I really enjoyed the conversation. So I'm wishing everyone in Canada a wonderful day. And I'm going to go off and have a glass of wine.
Nice. You go enjoy that. And you can also follow Mark on Instagram as well if you want to find him there. So thank you again. Until next time, be well, everyone.